everyone. We're really glad you've taken a step to join a group. My name is Emmy and I'll be your host throughout this study. Looking back at the first group I was a part of, I am so thankful for the relationships that formed in that group. Those are the people who could see the potential in me and were consistently challenging and supporting me in my own spiritual growth. We know it can be hard to define spiritual growth, but it's important for us all to be on the same page about what it is. And it's equally important for all of us to be able to recognize spiritual growth in our own lives and in each other's lives. So during these next couple of sessions, Sam Griffin, the Adult Ministries Director at Brazos Fellowship, is going to talk about spiritual growth. Today, he'll share a definition for spiritual growth and give us some handles that will make it easy to understand and identify.
Well, early on in my ministry, I had an interview with a church board for a church way out in West Texas for a position that would develop a plan for helping people grow spiritually. And towards the end of the interview, one of the guys doing the interviewing made this statement. He said, "I guess the only real question is how will we measure your success at this role?" At that point, another one of the interviewers chimed in, and he said this: "There's really no way to measure spiritual growth. We'll just have to trust that you're doing your job and leave the results to God." Well, that conversation really got me thinking. How do you measure spiritual growth? How do you even define spiritual growth? How would you define spiritual growth? I mean, we can look at other types of growth and come up with a very clear definition. There are tangible things like height and weight that we can measure to track physical growth. You can measure academic growth. You can even measure professional growth. But spiritual growth just seems a little squishier. It feels kind of like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Well, in Colossians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul writes to believers in Colossae, and he says this: "Just as you accepted Christ Jesus as your Lord, you must continue to follow him. Let your roots grow down into him, and let your lives be built on him. Then your faith will grow strong in the truth." Now, I don't have a green thumb, but I know that when I plant vegetables or flowers in our garden, for them to thrive and grow, their roots have to take hold in the soil. See, roots anchor the plant and they feed the plant, and the stronger the root system is, the more the plant will grow. I love this picture that Paul paints when he says, "Let your roots grow down into him." It's this idea of being rooted in Jesus, when our lives are anchored in and fed by Jesus, that will result in our faith growing strong. So I want us to take a step back and allow Jesus to speak to the question, what is spiritual growth? And let's plant ourselves there and let our roots grow deep into what he says. Well, that we know of, nobody ever asked Jesus specifically about spiritual growth. But in one instance, he was asked a question, and his answer gives us a great starting point for a conversation about spiritual growth. The question was this: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" This was one of the Pharisees that asked this question. And the Pharisees, they were sort of the guardians of the law. They were the religious leaders who devoted their lives to studying and memorizing and living by the law. In the law, this encompasses all the commandments that God had given the Israelites to live by in the Old Testament. You might be familiar with some of them, the 10 Commandments, but those 10 were just the introduction. There were literally hundreds of laws. And so essentially what he's asking is this: of all the hundreds and hundreds of laws, which is the greatest? And Jesus' response gives us a fantastic framework for what it looks like to grow spiritually. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment." He says, of all the laws, this is the most important. Love God with your heart. This is the seat of all your emotions. With your mind, all your thoughts. And with your soul, this is that thing inside of you that drives you. So love God with all that you are, with your entire being. Don't hold any part of yourself back in your love for God. And he could have stopped right there. There's kind of this vertical relationship or this vertical obligation that we have between us and God. And the greatest commandment, the greatest law is to stay faithful and our love for God within this vertical relationship. But he doesn't stop. Jesus goes on and he says this, the second is like it. The second is just as important. It's actually like the first. I want you to not only love God, but also, he says this, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is assuming here that we all love ourselves. We might not always like ourselves, but every single one of us make ourselves the center of our life. And Jesus says, the way you make yourself the center of your life, make your neighbor the center. And he finishes his answer with this remarkable statement. All the law, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Old Testament laws, and the prophets, all the things the prophets had taught for years and years, all of the law and all the prophets hang on these two commandments. He says, if you'll do these two things, love God with your entire being and love your neighbor the way you love yourself, you'll be doing what all the law and all the prophets are ultimately directing you to do. And so these two commandments, love God and equally important, love your neighbor, are so huge. And they give us a framework to understand what spiritual growth is. If you want to know what spiritual growth is, it's loving God and it's loving your neighbor as yourself. Jesus simplified it, but that doesn't mean it's easy to do. It's not easy to love God with your emotions, with your thoughts, with your motives and with your desires, and then to also love others and treat others better than you would treat yourself, to think of others more than you would think of yourself. He says this is what it looks like to grow spiritually, though. And if you want to know if you're growing spiritually, you look at how you're doing in your love for God and how you're doing in your love for others. Jesus taught this, he lived this, and there were people who followed Jesus and learned to live like he did. And one of them was John. John was one of Jesus' closest friends. And he says, and he repeats this teaching. He says, if you want to know what it's like to follow Jesus, to be rooted in him, it's all about the love that you have. Listen to the way he describes this in one of his letters. But if anyone obeys his word, if any one of us wants to do what he's asked us to do, if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. We have this love in us that's made complete. It's in our heart, it's in our mind, it's in our soul. And he says, if this love for God is made complete in us, then this is how we know. This is the evidence. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. If you want to know if someone has this love for God in them, the love that we have for God, this vertical love, is evidenced in a horizontal way. If you want to know how someone is loving God, you look at how they're treating other people. Jesus didn't just tell us this, he modeled it. It's the way he lived his life. He was constantly looking for people who were marginalized, people who were social and cultural outcasts, people who were hated and tossed aside as worthless. Jesus demonstrated a life that was others first. So if you want to know if someone has love for God on the inside, look at how they're living on the outside. Loving God and loving others can't be separated according to Jesus. And they create a picture for us of what spiritual growth is. And so what we've done is we've tried to put some handles on this in the way we talk about spiritual growth. We call them the 3 vital relationships. There are 3 relationships that you and I should pay attention to in regards to spiritual growth. The first one is intimacy with God. Intimacy means you are fully known and you're fully accepted. The most intimate relationships that any of us have are those relationships where we're fully known and we're fully accepted. And those relationships require trust because intimacy requires trust. And for every one of us, our hearts are longing for an intimate and growing relationship with God. So the first relationship we should pay attention to is our intimacy with God. And we pay attention to that by asking, am I trusting God with every part of my life? Is my intimacy with God growing? The second relationship is community with each other. And maybe that's why you're a part of the group you're in, because you want to connect with some other people. Making those connections is so important because this is where friendships can start to form. And we all need friends who will challenge us and encourage us. Friends where we can talk about how life and faith intersect. And you might not meet your new best friend, but as you begin to get to know people and they get to know you, you might gain some accountability in parts of your life where you've never been held accountable before. And you'll have a place where you really feel like you belong. And you'll have care on a regular basis with others. When you begin to experience these types of friendships in your life, the type where you look back and know that friendship made a difference, you'll know that you're growing in community. So 2 incredibly vital relationships are intimacy with God and community with each other. And there's a third, influence with the world. The early church leaders recognized that God loves those outside the church the same as He loves those who are inside the church. And there are people around you and me every day who fall into this category. And God has created us with a purpose, and that's that we would have influence with people who don't know Him, that they could experience this love as well. So to make it simple to understand, we've put these handles on this and say that to grow spiritually means that we have growing intimacy with God, we have growing community with each other, and we have growing influence with the world around us. As we talk about spiritual growth, these 3 vital relationships are so important because practicing the 3 vital relationships leads to spiritual growth. So to recognize and track spiritual growth, we can use these handles as sort of gauges to see how I'm doing at loving God, at growing in intimacy with Him, and how you're doing at loving God, at growing in intimacy with Him. Are you trusting Him more? Are there parts of your life where you're struggling to trust Him? How are you doing with community? Are you exercising kindness and forgiveness? Are you being patient with others? Are you encouraging them and opening up your life for them to challenge and encourage you? How are you doing with influence with the world around you? So back to the question at the very beginning, how do you define spiritual growth? It's this. Spiritual growth is the process of growing your faith in God and your love for others. And it is a process. It's a lifelong journey. It's the process of growing your faith in God and your love for others. It's demonstrated by your faith in God, growing in intimacy with God. And as your intimacy with God grows, your trust in God will grow. And it's validated by your love for others. The more you trust God, the more that you'll love others. So it's more faith and it's more love. As we grow spiritually, we'll see our faith grow and our love grow because that is what spiritual growth is. It's the process of growing your faith in God and your love for others.
Over the next few minutes, you'll have the opportunity to talk about how you have experienced spiritual growth in your own life. We hope you'll be able to celebrate areas where you've grown and identify areas where you need to grow. We also hope this group will be a place where you are encouraged and challenged to keep pursuing spiritual growth. At this point, you can stop the video and use the discussion questions in the Begin Guide to help start your conversation.